Chapter 13. Missing in Action. On the early, hazy morning of June 19, 1953, a rush of coordinated activity began on the tarmac at K-13. The smell of JP-4 was in the air as refuelers filled the tanks of 4 F-86F Sabres that were being prepared for a morning mission. They also filled up the two 200-gallon drop tanks attached to the outboard pylons under the aircraft's wings. An APU was plugged into each plane for startup. Armorers unloaded 1,000-pound bombs from their trucks and wheeled them on a cart over to the aircraft. Using a manually operated lift system, they carefully hoisted the bombs and attached them to the inboard pylons. When the fueling and loading were done, the pilots, together with their crew chiefs, performed a walk-around inspection of their planes. After climbing aboard their F-86s and getting strapped into their seats, the pilots plugged in their G-suit hose, had their oxygen hose connected, and ejection seat safety pin removed. Other procedures and checks were methodically carried out. Engine startup followed, and then at the proper time, the planes taxied out to the runway. At approximately 10:40 a.m., the flight took off from K-13, each carrying their maximum load of bombs and .50 caliber ammunition. Colonel William E. Elder, who had just been assigned the new commanding officer of the 8th Fighter Bomber Wing a few weeks earlier, was the flight leader on this mission. He had already pre-briefed the pilots, who were from Mike Flight, that it would be an armed reconnaissance mission called Bromide 21, and the primary target would be personnel and supply shelters in the Charlie Tear area, which was deep in North Korean territory along the eastern sector. After dropping their bombs on the shelters, the flight would then break up into separate elements and patrol the roads in the Charlie Tear and Charlie Uncle areas. Charlie Uncle was a section on the map that covered the area southwest of Wonsan, and Charlie Tear was slightly south of there. Although Colonel Elder was the designated flight leader on this mission, he didn't have much, if any, experience flying into North Korea, which was crucial for these types of missions. So the pilot assigned the number 2 position, Second Lieutenant Kermit E. Keeley, actually flew as Mike Lead, while Colonel Elder flew as his wingman. The other 2 pilots from Mike Flight assigned to this mission were Second Lieutenant Jim Escalle as element leader, Mike 3, and First Lieutenant Jack Seneff, who flew as Jim's wingman, Mike 4. On this particular mission, Jim was flying an F-86F that was normally assigned to First Lieutenant William M. Bill DeMint, who was flight leader for Uncle Flight at the time. Jim's aircraft was not available due to maintenance problems, so he was assigned to DeMint's plane. This aircraft had the name the Georgia Peach written on the right gun panel door by its crew chief. It also had 2 diagonal red stripes painted across the nose, designating a flight leader's plane. If Jim flew his own aircraft on this mission, it would have 1 stripe across the nose, designating an element leader's plane. As soon as the flight reached cruising altitude, it wasn't long before they arrived at the Charlie Tear area. The personnel and supply shelters were soon spotted, and the flight began its bombing run. As each pilot took his turn diving into the target, he would at exactly the right moment press the small button located next to the trim switch at the top of his flight control stick, releasing the deadly half-ton ordnance under each inside pylon of his aircraft. With this onslaught of firepower, the shelters were totally destroyed. When the flight regrouped, Colonel Elder ordered it to split into elements and continue with the next phase of the mission, which was road reconnaissance. Patrolling in both Charlie Tear and Charlie Uncle areas, the 2 elements went hunting for any vehicles coming down roads leading from the main supply routes. After about 15 minutes scanning the different roads in the area, Jim called his wingman on the radio and said that he spotted a convoy of camouflage trucks parked on the side of a road in the valley below. This dirt road in the Charlie Uncle area jutted south off the main supply route, going west from Wonsan to Pyongyang. It ran south alongside the Imjin River and snaked its way down a wide valley with 2 steep hills on either side. The hills ran the entire length of this valley, so the risks for potential anti-aircraft fire were everywhere. Knowing this, the decision was made to strafe the trucks from different directions. This would mean, however, the 2 jets would lose visual contact with each other, so to maintain their relative positions to the trucks, radio calls would be used. As element leader, Jim initiated the first strafing pass going north to south, firing away with all 6 of his aircraft's guns. After pulling out, Jim called his wingman and told him that he had broken off the target and for him to go in. Lieutenant Seneff made his pass from south to north, again ripping trucks apart with the Sabre's arsenal of 50 caliber ammunition. After pulling out, Seneff saw some more trucks and called Jim. I told Jim that I saw more trucks in the area. Jim, in the meantime, had already spotted them. He told me that he was going in again, this time from west to east. I orbited while Jim went on his second strafing pass, waiting for the call that he was off the target. But the call never came. So I went ahead and made my second pass, going from east to west. After pulling off the target, I called Jim again, but still received no answer. I then climbed to about 10,000 feet and circled the immediate area, looking for any sign of Jim while at the same time trying to call him on Green Channel, which was the channel we were working, but to no avail. I then tried contacting him on Gray Channel, which was the 8th Group's common channel, but still no answer. I continued to orbit the target area, and along with the lead element, looked for any sign of a crash, a parachute, or anything that would indicate Jim's whereabouts. After a while, another flight joined in the search, but then had to continue with its assigned mission. Jim's flight reported him missing, but continued to search until their fuel status forced them to return to K-13 without their element leader. When the flight landed back at K-13, a RESCAP, Rescue Combat Air Patrol, was immediately launched and a search was made for Jim. This new flight went back to the area where Jim was last seen and looked again for any sign of him or his aircraft. The burning wreckage of an F-86 Sabre was soon spotted about 8 miles south-southwest of the target area. They knew it was the aircraft Jim was flying because the entire tail section was seen, along with part of a wing, but no sign of Jim anywhere. Since the crash site was deep into North Korea, a helicopter search and rescue team wasn't sent in because of the dangers involved. Also, the weather was beginning to take a turn for the worse again. Jim was then officially listed as missing in action. Before the day ended, the 36th Fighter Bomber Squadron would wrap up this hectic week in June by losing, or so they thought at the time, another pilot to ground fire. On a late afternoon armed reconnaissance mission, First Lieutenant Albert V. Vic Hodges, Jr. of Victor Flight was hit by automatic weapons fire as he came off his dive bomb run on a road bridge in the Charlie Tear area. He ejected safely and his flight saw him parachute to the ground, but he was immediately captured after he hit the ground. He was listed as MIA at first, and then later reclassified a POW. The squadron was relieved to find out he was okay when he was repatriated after the war. While hope remained that Jim would be found alive somewhere, such as in a POW camp, the grim task of clearing out his area of the hut was done by some of his buddies. Lieutenant Jim O'Connell, who had the bunk next to Jim, along with Lieutenant Keeley, who was on his last flight, put all of Jim's clothes and other items, including his 52F class ring, into boxes to be later shipped home. Just the day before, the pilots in Mike Flight did the same thing after Lieutenant Hamilton was killed in the C-124 crash. The pilots in Queen Flight did it for Lieutenants Stacy and Mouton. This kind of scene became far too common for the guys in the squadron, even though it occurred regularly throughout the war for every fighter-bomber squadron. Several days after Jim was reported missing, his squadron commander, Major Ruby, filed an officer effectiveness report on him. Since there was a possibility that Jim could still be alive and would someday return to the squadron, Ruby used the present tense when writing about him. In his report, Major Ruby writes, "Lieutenant Escalle is a very personable, intelligent young officer with a quiet sense of humor. He is always neat in appearance and well-mannered. In his assigned capacity as a jet fighter pilot, he has flown a total of 41 combat missions and advanced to the role of element leader due to his excellent air judgment. Though relatively inexperienced, he spends a great deal of his spare time with maintenance personnel on the flight line learning, and he has gained widespread respect among officer and airman personnel for his diligent efforts to improve himself. He has been recently cited for the Soldier's Medal, for an act that demonstrated his lack of personal well-being during an emergency requiring quick, intelligent action. He has had little opportunity to demonstrate his ability to command due to his inexperience. However, I am confident that his growth potential is superior to that of his contemporaries, and it would be a distinct pleasure to serve with him at any future time. Jim's role as a fighter-bomber pilot was not a glamorous one, but like the rest of the pilots in the 36th who had the privilege of flying the F-86 Sabre in air-to-ground operations, he was proud of the job he performed. Sure, he wanted to shoot down a MiG or two like the interceptor pilots on the other side of the base, but his primary assignment was that of a mud mover, and he did that job extremely well. There were no red stars painted on his aircraft after blowing up a bridge, or a Stars and Stripes reporter chasing him down for an interview after a dangerous and nerve-wracking close air support mission. The greatest rewards that he and the other pilots received were not put on with paint or written down in ink. Instead, one of their biggest rewards was when someone in the U.S. 8th Army would call in to K-13 with a well done after one of those harrowing ground support missions. In Korea, more pilots had been killed or listed as missing in action due to being shot down by ground fire rather than by enemy aircraft. Every pilot who flew fighter-bomber missions knew the hazards involved, and he also knew that his next mission might be his last. So his job required a whole lot of intestinal fortitude. Jim had plenty of this, as did every other pilot in our squadron, recalled Jim James, a 36th Fighter-Bomber Squadron pilot from Queen Flight, and also one of Jim's 52F classmates. Just as when Jim played baseball in high school and college, each pilot in the squadron was part of a team. If the team wanted to win, then each pilot and ground crewman had to do his job at the best of his ability. And just like the teams he played with in school, the 36th Fighter-Bomber Squadron was a winning team. Jim gave his team everything he had, and in the end, it included giving the ultimate sacrifice. On June 24th, after waiting 5 days to see if anything new on Jim's status came through to K-13, his flight leader sat down and wrote a letter to his parents explaining the details of the mission Jim was on when he became missing in action. Probably the most unenviable task that a flight leader had to do, he wrote, "Dear Mr. and Mrs. Escalle, we of Mike Flight feel that you are wondering about the details of the flight on which your son Jimmy became missing in action. With hopes that this might be your wish, I shall endeavor to give you the information in a brief form. On June 19th, Jim was flying an armed reconnaissance patrol on a main supply route some 30 miles deep in enemy territory. The purpose of this mission was to seek enemy vehicles along the route and destroy them. During the patrol, Jim spotted a group of trucks and, with his wingman, began strafing passes on them. Since he and his wingman were making their passes in opposite directions to avoid as much anti-aircraft fire as possible, they lost visual contact with each other and maintained their relative positions to the trucks by radio calls. Jim called that he was going in on his second pass, so the wingman remained high, waiting for the call that Jim was off his target. When this call did not come for several seconds, the wingman began his second pass, having decided that Jim was already off. Upon pulling off the target, the wingman called Jim for his position, but received no answer. He then began circling the immediate area looking for Jim and calling him repeatedly from the radio. After considerable time in circling, calling, and receiving no answer or sight of Jim, the wingman had to return home due to low fuel. When the wingman arrived at the base with his report, a flight was immediately sent back to the area to search. This flight searched over the entire area of the target and soon spotted the smoking wreckage of an aircraft a few miles south of the target. Since no sight was made of Jim and no radio calls were received from him, it is quite possible that he may have had to bail out in a hurry with no time for calls. However, in all honesty to you, chances are against this possibility. As flight commander of Mike Flight, I quickly found that Jim was one of our better pilots soon after his arrival here. I might add that as an officer and a buddy, he was one of the squadron's most popular men. His absence is well felt amongst us all. We all join with you in hopes and prayers that he will rejoin us again. Should I be of any service to you, please feel free to call upon me for anything. I'll be more than glad to do my best in any way. Sincerely, First Lieutenant Jack B. Mayo. Jim was only 23 years old when he was reported missing. Receiving this letter from Lieutenant Mayo explaining what happened to his oldest boy on his final mission was sure to break Frank Escalle's heart. The question remained, at this point, of how Frank would react when he found out Jim was listed as MIA. Bob was still at Nellis Air Force Base at the time, so he would probably get the news about his brother either directly or indirectly. Since Jim was so well loved in his hometown, and the citizens there were so proud of him when he became the first jet pilot in the area, they were going to be devastated upon hearing the news that Jim was missing in action. He was not only Frank's son, but theirs as well.